The Dhammapada, Chapter 13, Loka Vagga, the world. Verse 167. Give up base desires. Hinang dhammang seveya, pamadena na sangvase, michadithing seveya, nasiya loka vadhano. Do not follow a life of evil. Do not live heedlessly. Do not have false views. Do not value worldly things. In this way, one can get rid of suffering. A bhikkhu who quarreled with a young girl. Once, a young bhikkhu accompanied an older bhikkhu to the house of Visakha. After accepting the alms food, the elder left for another place, leaving the young bhikkhu behind at the house of Visakha. The granddaughter of Visakha was filtering some water for the young bhikkhu, and when she saw her own reflection in the big water pot, she laughed. When the young bhikkhu saw her laughing, he also laughed. When she saw the young bhikkhu laughing at her, she commented, "You shaven head, why are you laughing at me?" The young bhikkhu replied, "You are a shaven head yourself. Your mother and your father are also shaven heads." Hearing the remarks, the young girl went weeping to her grandmother. Visakha immediately told the young bhikkhu, "Please don't get angry with my young granddaughter. She does not mean to be disrespectful. But a bhikkhu does have his head shaved, and putting on a robe which is made up of cut pieces, he goes on the alms round with a bowl which is rimless." What this young girl said was, in a way, quite right, is it not? The young bhikkhu replied, "It is true, but why should she abuse me on that account?" At this point, the elder bhikkhu returned, but both Visakha and the old bhikkhu failed to appease the young bhikkhu and the young girl. Soon after this, the Buddha arrived and learned about the misunderstanding. He knew that time was ripe for the young bhikkhu to attain the first stage of sainthood, and to make the young bhikkhu more responsive to his words. The Buddha asked Visakha, "Is there any reason for your granddaughter to address my son as a shaven head, just because he has his head shaven? After all, he had his head shaven to enter my order." Hearing these words, the young bhikkhu paid his respects to the Buddha and said, "Venerable Sir, you alone understand me. Neither my teacher nor this grandmother understands me." The Buddha knew that the young bhikkhu was then in a receptive mood to comprehend the Dhamma, and so he said, "To enjoy with sensual desire is ignoble. It is not right and proper to have ignoble thoughts." Verse 168. The righteous are happy. Uttithe nappamajaya dhammang sucharitang chare dhammachari sukhang seti asming loke parang hicha. A man should not live heedlessly, but should exert himself to live righteously. Such a man is happy in this world and in the next. Verse 169. Be righteous. Dhammang chare sucharitang, nanang duccharitang chare, dhammachari sukhang seti, asming loke parang hicha. A man should live righteously and not wrongly. Such a man is happy in this world and in the next. The Buddha visits Kapilavatthu. When the Buddha visited Kapilavatthu for the first time ever after his enlightenment, he stayed at the Nigrodharama monastery. There, he expounded the Dhamma to his relatives. King Suddhodana thought that the Buddha, being his own son, would not go anywhere, but would surely come to the palace for alms food the next day. But he did not specifically invite the Buddha. However, the next day he ordered alms food to be prepared for him and his bhikkhus. As there was no special invitation for almsgiving on that day, the Buddha and his bhikkhus went for their alms round. Before proceeding, he considered within himself, did the Buddhas of the past, upon entering the city of their kinsfolk, straightway enter the houses of the relatives? Or did they go from house to house to receive alms? Perceiving that they did go from house to house, the Buddha went along the streets of Kapilavatthu seeking alms. On hearing of this seemingly humiliating conduct of the Buddha from his daughter-in-law, Yashodhara, the king, greatly perturbed, went to the Buddha and said, "Son, why do you ruin me? I am overwhelmed with shame to see you begging alms. Is it proper for you, who used to travel in a golden palanquin, to seek alms in this very city? Why do you put me to shame?" Whereupon the Buddha replied, "O king, I am not putting you to shame. I am simply following the custom of my Buddha lineage. All previous Buddhas have lived by seeking alms." The king understood that this was the way of the Buddhas and accepted it. Verse 170. Like a bubble is this world. Yatha bubbulakang passe, yatha passe marichikang, evang lokang avekkantang, machu raja napassati. Just as one would look upon a bubble, just as one would look upon a mirage, if a person thus looks upon the world, the king of death sees him not. Meditation on a mirage. On one occasion, a few hundred bhikkhus went into the forest to practice meditation. But as they made very slow progress, they decided to return to the Buddha to ask for a suitable subject of meditation. On their way to the monastery, they saw a mirage and started to meditate on it. As soon as they entered the compound of the monastery, a storm broke out. As big drops of rain fell, bubbles were formed on the ground and soon disappeared. Seeing those bubbles, the bhikkhus reflected, "This body of ours is perishable, like these bubbles," and perceived the impermanent nature of component things. Verse 171. The wise are not attached to the world. Itha passat hinam lokang, chittang raja ratupamang, yatha bala visidanti, nathi sango vijanatang. Come, behold this world, which is like unto an ornamented royal chariot, wherein fools flounder, but for the wise there is no attachment. How the Buddha consoled a sad prince, Abhaya. On one occasion, Prince Abhaya triumphantly returned after suppressing a rebellion at the frontier. King Bimbisara was so pleased with him that for 7 days Abhaya was given the glory and honor of a ruler, together with a dancing girl to entertain him. On the last day, while the dancer was entertaining the prince and his company in the garden, she had a severe stroke. She collapsed and died on the spot. The prince was shocked and very much distressed. Sorrowfully, he went for solace to the Buddha, who said, "O Prince, the tears you have shed all through the round of rebirths cannot be measured. This world of component things is the place where fools flounder." A note from the author. In regards to component things mentioned earlier. In Buddhism, we have a term that describes and is used for component things making up an individual. This term is khandhas. According to the Buddha, this so-called being is composed of 5 groups, vis-a-vis rupa, matter, vedana, feeling, sanya, perception, sankhara, mental volitional states, and vijnana, consciousness. These are the 5 psychophysical component parts that constitute an individual. Matter is composed of forces and qualities. Mind too is composed of mental states or cetasikas. There are 52 mentioned in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Of them, Vedana and Sanya are treated as 2 distinct groups. The remaining 50 are collectively called Sankhara. Verse 172. The heedful illuminate the world. Yocha pubbe pamajjitva pachaso nappamajjati so imang lokang pabhaseti abha muttova chandima. A man who is free from heedlessness and is heedless no more purifies himself and shines in this world like the moon, which is freed from a cloud. The monk with a broom, Sammunjani. Venerable Sammunjani spent most of his time sweeping the compound of the monastery. At that time, Venerable Revata was also staying at the monastery. Unlike Sammunjani, he spent most of his time in meditation or deep mental absorption. Seeing Revata's behavior, Sammunjani thought he was just idling away his time. Thus, one day, Sammunjani told him, "You are very lazy, living on the food offered by the devotees out of faith and generosity. Don't you think you should sometimes sweep the floors or the compound or some other place?" Revata replied, "Friend, a bhikkhu should not spend all his time sweeping. He should sweep early in the morning, then go out on the alms round. After the meal, contemplating his body, he should try to perceive the true nature of life, or else recite the suttas until nightfall. Then he can go and do the sweeping again if he so wishes." Sammunjani strictly followed the advice given by Revata and soon attained arahanthood. Other bhikkhus noticed that Sammunjani was not sweeping as much as he used to. When questioned by the bhikkhus, Sammunjani replied, "When I was not mindful, I was sweeping all the time. But now I am no longer unmindful." When the bhikkhus heard his reply, they were skeptical. So they went to the Buddha and said, "Venerable Sir, Sammunjani claims to be an arahant." The Buddha assured them that he had indeed attained arahanthood. Verse 173. Evil can be erased by good. Yassa papang katang kammang kusalena pitiyati so imang lokang pabhaseti abbha mutto vachandima. Whosoever by a good deed covers the evil done, Such a one illuminates this world like the moon freed from the clouds. A murderer who attained sainthood. Angulimala. Angulimala was the son of a Brahmin in the court of King Pasenadi of Kosala. His original name was Ahinsaka. He was sent to Taxila for his studies. Ahinsaka was intelligent and was also obedient to his teacher. So he was liked by the teacher and his wife, as a result of which other pupils became jealous of him. So they went to the teacher and falsely accused Ahinsaka of having an affair with his wife. At first he did not believe them, but after being told a number of times, he thought it was true and he vowed to have revenge on Ahinsaka. He considered that to kill him would reflect badly on him. So he thought of a plan worse than killing the innocent pupil. He told Ahinsaka to kill 1,000 human beings and to bring one right-hand finger of each as payment for teaching him. In obedience to the teacher, though with great reluctance, he started to kill people. The fingers so collected were hung on a tree, but as they were destroyed by crows and vultures, he later wore a garland of those fingers to ascertain the exact number. Because of this, he came to be known as Angulimala, finger garland, and became the terror of the countryside. The king himself heard about the exploits of Angulimala and he decided to capture him. When Mantani, the mother of Angulimala, heard about the king's intention, she went into the forest in a desperate bid to save her son. By this time, the chain around the neck of Angulimala had 999 fingers in it, just one finger short of 1,000. Early in the morning on that day, the Buddha saw him in his vision, and reflected that if he did not intervene, Angulimala, who was on the lookout for the last person to make up the 1,000, would see his mother and might kill her. In that case he would have to suffer in hell for an even longer period. So, out of compassion, the Buddha left for the forest. Angulimala, after many sleepless days and nights, was very tired and near exhaustion. At the same time, he was very anxious to kill the last person to make up his full quota of 1,000 and so complete his task. He made up his mind to kill the first person he met. Just then, as he looked out, he saw the Buddha and ran after him with his knife raised. But the Buddha kept moving ahead of him. Angulimala just could not catch up with him. Finally he cried out, "O Bhikkhu, stop! Stop!" And the Enlightened One replied, "I have stopped. It is you who have not stopped." Angulimala did not get the significance of the words. So he asked, "O Bhikkhu, why do you say that you have stopped while I have not?" The Buddha replied, "I say that I have stopped because I have given up killing all beings. I have given up ill-treating all beings, and have established myself in universal love, patience, and knowledge through reflection. But you have not given up killing or ill-treating others, and you are not yet established in universal love and patience. Hence, you are the one who has not stopped." On hearing these words, Angulimala reflected, "These are the words of a wise man. This monk is so very wise and so very brave that he must be the leader of the monks. Indeed, he must be the Enlightened One himself. He must have come here specially to make me see the light." So thinking, he threw away his weapon and asked the Enlightened One to admit him to the order of bhikkhus, which the Buddha did. Angulimala's mother looked for her son everywhere in the forest, shouting out his name, but failing to find him. She returned home. When the king and his men came to capture Angulimala, they found him at the monastery of the Buddha. Finding that Angulimala had given up his evil ways and had become a bhikkhu, the king and his men agreed to leave him alone. During his stay at the monastery, Angulimala ardently and diligently practiced meditation. Angulimala had no peace of mind, because even in his solitary meditation, he used to recall memories of his past and the pathetic cries of his unfortunate victims. As a result of his evil karma, while seeking alms in the streets, he would become a target of stray stones and sticks, and he would return to the Jetavana monastery with broken head and flowing blood, cut and bruised, to be reminded by the Buddha, "My son Angulimala, you have done away with evil. Have patience. This is the effect of the evil deeds you have committed in this existence. Your evil karma would have made you suffer for innumerable years in hell had I not met you." One morning, while going on an alms round in Savatthi, Angulimala heard someone crying out in pain. When he came to know that a pregnant lady was having labor pains and facing difficulty to deliver the child, he reflected, "All worldlings are subject to suffering." Moved by compassion, he reported this pathetic woman's suffering to the Buddha, who then advised him to recite the following words of truth, which later came to be known as Angulimala Paritta. Going to the presence of the suffering woman, he sat on a seat separated from her by a screen, and uttered these words: "Yato ham bhagini ariyaya jatiya jato nabhijanami sanchicha panang jivita voropeta tena satchena sothi te hotu sothi gabbhasati." Sister, since the day I became an arahant, I have not consciously destroyed the life of any living beings. By this truth, may you be well, and may your unborn child be well. Instantly the woman delivered her child with ease. Both the mother and child were well and healthy. The efficacy of this paritta persists to this day. Angulimala liked living in solitude and in seclusion. Later he passed away peacefully. As an arahant, he had attained parinibbana. Other bhikkhus asked the Buddha where Angulimala was reborn, and when he replied, "My son Angulimala has attained parinibbana," they could hardly believe it. So they asked whether it was possible that a man who had killed so many people could have attained parinibbana. To this question, the Buddha replied, "Bhikkhus, Angulimala had done much evil because he did not have good friends. But later he found good friends, and through their help and good advice, he had been steadfast and mindful in his practice of the Dhamma and meditation. Therefore, his evil deeds have been overwhelmed by good karma, and his mind has been completely rid of all defilements." Verse 174. Few are the clear-sighted. Andha bhuto ayang loko tanukke tha vipassati sakunto jala mutto va appo saggaya gacchati. Blind is this world. Few are those who clearly see. As few birds escape from a net, few go to a blissful state. The weaver girl who realized the nature of life. One day, the Buddha gave a discourse on the impermanence of life at Alavi. He admonished, "Practice meditation on death. Reflect mindfully. Uncertain is my life. Certain is my death. Certainly, one day I have to face death." The Buddha also exhorted his listeners to be always mindful and to strive to perceive the true nature of life. He also said, "As one who is armed with a stick or spear is prepared to meet an enemy and some other poisonous and dangerous animals, so also one who is ever mindful of death should face death mindfully. He will then leave this world for a good destination." Many people could not grasp the essence of the discourse, but a young girl of 16, who was a weaver, clearly understood the Buddha's discourse. After the sermon, the Buddha returned to the Jetavana monastery. One day, when the Buddha was surveying the world, he saw the young weaver in his vision, and knew that the time was ripe for the girl to attain the first stage of sainthood. So he came to the village of Alavi to expound the Dhamma for the second time. When the girl heard that the Buddha had come again with a few hundred bhikkhus, she wanted to go and listen to the religious discourse. However, her father had also asked her to wind some thread spools which he needed urgently. So she promptly wound the spools and took them to her father. On the way, she stopped for a moment at the outer fringe of the audience who had come to listen to the Buddha. Meanwhile, the Buddha knew that the young weaver would come to listen to his discourse. He also knew that it was very important that she should listen to the Dhamma on her way to the weaving shed and not on her return. As her future existence was uncertain because her karmic energy for survival was going to be extinguished very soon. So, when the young weaver appeared on the fringe of the audience, the Buddha looked at her. When she saw him looking at her, she dropped her basket and respectfully approached the enlightened one. Then he put 4 questions to her, and she answered all of them. The Buddha asked, "Where have you come from?" The girl responded, "I don't know." The Buddha asked, "Where are you going?" The girl responded, "I don't know." The Buddha asked, "Don't you know?" The girl responded, "Yes, I know." The Buddha asked, "Do you know?" The girl responded, "I don't know, Venerable Sir." Hearing her answers, the audience thought that the weaver was being very disrespectful. Then the Buddha asked her to explain what she meant by her answers, and she said, "Venerable Sir, since you know that I have come from my house, I take it that by your first question you meant to ask me from what past existence I have come here. Hence my answer, I don't know. The second question meant, to what future existence would I be going from here? Hence my answer, I don't know. The third question meant whether I don't know that I would die one day. Hence my answer, yes, I do know. The last question meant whether I know when I would die. Hence my answer, I don't know." The Buddha applauded her for the explanation of her answers. At the conclusion of the discourse, she attained the first stage of sainthood. Then she continued on her way to the weaving shed. When she got there, her father was asleep on the weaver's seat. As he woke up suddenly, he accidentally pulled the shuttle, and the point of the shuttle struck the girl at her breast. she died on the spot and was reborn in the Tushita Deva world. Her father was heartbroken and with eyes full of tears, yet realizing the uncertainty of life, he went and requested the Buddha to admit him into the order. Thus, he became a bhikkhu, and not long afterwards attained arahanthood. Verse 175. The wise seek an escape from this world. Hangsadicca pathe yanti, akase yanti idhiya, niyanti dhira lokamha, jetva marang savahini. Swans wing along on the path of the sun. Men go through air by psychic powers. The wise are led away from the world, having conquered Mara and his host. Verse 176. There is no evil that a liar cannot commit. Ekang dhammang atitasya musavadisya jantuno vitinna paralokasya nathi papang akaryang. There is no evil that cannot be done by the liar, who has transgressed the one law of truthfulness, and who is indifferent to a world beyond. Chincha Manavika falsely accuses the Buddha. As the Buddha went on expounding the Dhamma, more and more people came flocking to him, and the ascetics of other faiths found their following to be dwindling. So they decided to ruin the reputation of the Buddha. They instigated Chincha Manavika, a beautiful pupil of theirs, and told her, "If you have our interests at heart, please help us and put the Buddha to shame." She agreed to their plot. That same evening, she took some flowers and went in the direction of the Jetavana monastery. When people asked her where she was going, she replied, "What is the use of you knowing where I'm going?" Then she would go to the place of the other ascetics near the Jetavana monastery, and would come back early in the morning to make it appear as if she had spent the night at the Jetavana monastery. When asked, she would reply, "I spent the night with the Buddha at the monastery." After 3 or 4 months had passed, she wrapped some cloth around her stomach to make herself look pregnant. Then, after 9 months, she created the impression of a woman in an advanced stage of pregnancy, and she went to the monastery to confront the Buddha. The Buddha was then expounding the Dhamma to a congregation of bhikkhus and laymen. Seeing him preaching, she accused him. "Oh, you big samana, you are clever to preach to others. I am now pregnant by you, yet you do nothing for my confinement. You only know how to enjoy yourself." The Buddha stopped preaching for a while and said to her, "Sister, only you and I know whether you are speaking the truth or not." "Yes, you are right. How can others know what only you and I have done?" At that instant, Sakka, king of the Devas, became aware of the trouble taking place at the Jetavana monastery. So he sent 4 of his Devas in the form of young rats, who got under her clothes and bit off the strings that held the cloth around her belly. Thus her deception was uncovered, and many from the crowd reprimanded her. "O you wicked woman, liar and a cheat! How dare you accuse our noble teacher?" Fearing for her safety, she ran from the monastery as fast as she could. However, after some distance, she met with an unfortunate accident and had to face a miserable and untimely death. The next day, While the bhikkhus were talking about Chincha Manavika, the Buddha told them, Bhikkhus, one who is not afraid to tell lies and who does not care what happens in the future existences will not hesitate to do any evil. The Buddha then revealed that Chincha Manavika, in one of her past existences, was born as the chief consort to a king. She fell in love with the king's son, but the prince did not reciprocate her love. So she conceived an evil plan to harm him. She disfigured her body with her own hands. Then she went to the king and falsely accused that his son had done this to her when she refused his advances. Without investigating, the king banished his son from his kingdom. When the king came to know of the true situation, she was duly punished for her evil deeds. Verse 177. The stingy are not happy. Nave kadariya devalokang vajanti bala have nappa santi danang dhirocha danang anumodamano teneva sohoti sukhi paratha. Verily, misers go not to the celestial realms. Fools do not indeed praise liberality. The wise man rejoices in giving and thereby becomes happy thereafter. The almsgiving competition. Once, King Pasenadi offered alms to the Buddha and other bhikkhus on a grand scale. His subjects, in competition with him, organized another almsgiving ceremony on a grander scale than that of the king. Thus, the king and his subjects kept on competing in giving alms. Finally, Queen Mallika thought of a plan. To implement this plan, she asked the king to have a grand pavilion built. Next, she asked for a few hundred white umbrellas and a few hundred tame elephants. The elephants were to hold the white umbrellas over the bhikkhus. In the middle of the pavilion, they kept 10 boats which were filled with perfumes and incense. There were also many princesses to serve the food. Since the subjects of the king had no princesses, nor white umbrellas, nor elephants, they could no longer compete with the king. When all preparations were made, alms food was offered. After the meal, the king made an offering of all the things in the pavilion to the Buddha. At the time, 2 ministers of the king were present. One was very happy and praised the king for having offered alms so generously to the Buddha and the bhikkhus. He also reflected that such offerings could only be made by a king. He was very glad because the king would share the merit of his good deeds with all beings. In short, the minister rejoiced with the king in his unrivaled charity. The other minister, on the other hand, thought that the king was only squandering his wealth and that the bhikkhus, after their meal, would just go back to the monastery and sleep. After the meal, the Buddha looked over at the audience and knew how the second minister was feeling. Then, he reflected that if he were to deliver a lengthy discourse of appreciation, or anumodana, the minister would get more dissatisfied. So, out of compassion for him, the Buddha delivered only a short discourse and returned to the monastery. The king had expected a lengthy discourse of appreciation, and so he was disappointed because the Buddha only gave a brief sermon. The king wondered if he had failed to do something which should have been done. He decided to go to the monastery to find out. On seeing the king, the Buddha said, "Great king, you should rejoice that you have succeeded in making the offering of unrivaled charity. Such an opportunity comes very rarely. It comes only once during the appearance of each Buddha. But one of your ministers had felt that it was a waste and was not at all appreciative. So if I had given a lengthy discourse, he would have become more and more dissatisfied and accrued more bad karma. That was why I preached so briefly. Then the Buddha added, O king, fools do not rejoice in the charities given by others and go to the lower worlds. The wise rejoice in other people's charities, and through appreciation they share in the merit gained by others and go to the abode of the Devas. Verse 178. Spiritual advancement is better than worldly sovereignty. Pathavya eka rajjena saggasya gamanena va sabba lokadhi pachena sota patti pahalang varang. Better than absolute sovereignty over the earth, better than going to heaven, better than even lordship over all the worlds is the fruit of a stream winner. The story of Kala, son of Anathapindika. Kala, son of Anathapindika, always kept away whenever the Buddha and his monks came to their house. Anathapindika was afraid that if his son kept on behaving in this way, his future would be very uncertain. So he enticed his son with the promise of money. He promised to give him 100 pieces of gold if he would go to the monastery and observe the precepts for 1 day. So the youth went to the monastery and returned home early the next day without listening to any religious discourse. His father offered him good food, but instead of taking it, he first demanded the money. The next day the father said, My son, if you can recite a stanza of the Buddha's teaching, I will give you 1,000 pieces of gold on your return. So Kala went to the monastery again. The Buddha delivered a sermon, but at the same time he willed that he would not be able to memorize anything. He knew that Kala was only interested in the money and was not sincere to learn the Dhamma. Thus, the youth had to repeat a single stanza many times. As he did this, he came to perceive the full meaning of the Dhamma and attained the first stage of sainthood. Early on the next morning, he followed the Buddha and the bhikkhus to his own house. But on that day he was silently hoping, I wish my father would not give me the money in the presence of the Buddha. I do not wish the Buddha to know that I observe the precepts just for the sake of money. After offering alms food to the Buddha and the bhikkhus, Anathapindika brought 1,000 pieces of gold and asked Kala to take it, but surprisingly he refused. Then Anathapindika told the Buddha, Venerable Sir, my son has changed his mind. He now behaves in a very noble manner. Then he related to the Buddha how he had enticed him with money to go to the monastery to learn the Dhamma. The Buddha replied, Anathapindika, your son has realized the Dhamma, which is much better than the riches of the universal monarch, or that of the Devas, or that of the Brahmas.